Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming tonight. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, the National Constitution Center. The National Constitution Center, as some of you know, is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the US Constitution on a non-partisan basis. And today we have a really special treat, which is the chance to talk about a superb new book by Sarah Lewis, which, although not directly about constitutional topics, will open your eyes and illuminate the way that you think about success, failure, and most of all, creativity and mastery. I had the pleasure of reading it in one sitting and just learned so much from it. I can't wait to share it with you. Before we get started and before I introduce Sarah properly, I just want to put in a quick plug for the superb new exhibit that we opened yesterday. This is Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello. It's on view through October 19th, 2014. It's just a remarkable telling of the story of slavery in early America through 6 families who worked at Jefferson's plantation and the story of their descendants. It's co-presented by Monticello, by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and also the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I do hope so much that you'll visit it. We also have a remarkable range of town hall programs coming up in the coming weeks, including a talk with Cass Sunstein about his great new book, and Lynn Cheney, and also a panel about the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act with Bruce Ackerman of Yale Law School and others. Sarah Lewis is a faculty member at Yale. She has served on President Obama's Arts Policy Committee. She was selected for Oprah's Power List. Her essays have been published in the New Yorker, in Art Forum, Art in America, and in publications for the Smithsonian, the Museum of Modern Art, among others. She's held curatorial positions at the Tate Modern, the Museum of Modern Art. She is a graduate of Harvard College, of Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and has just finished her PhD at Yale University, which is very exciting. And she's here to discuss this superb new book, The Rise, Creativity, the Gift of Failure, and the Search for Mastery. Sarah, congratulations on this wonderful book. And tell me, how did you choose to write about this surprising topic of the gift of failure and the search for mastery?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's really an honor. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you about a book that I, in some ways, have been writing for the past 17 years. I was always interested, as a young girl, in how it is that we become our fullest selves. And I would look at the life stories of many people who inspired me and noticed that oftentimes there was an advantage that came in the very thing that I might have liked avoiding, in my life. I remember going to Sotheby's and looking at the papers of Martin Luther King on display and noticed that he received 2 C's, and you can probably guess what class, in public speaking class.
Wow.
In seminary, and I thought, am I seeing things? I mean, this is really what it appears to be, perhaps a moment where he thought to himself, what it is that I'm failing at is actually what it is that I'm strongest or that I want to do most. And I thought that the life stories of these individuals weren't being told fully.
And you say in the book that Martin Luther King had a tic when he spoke, but he overcame it.
That's right. At the end of his life, Harry Belafonte noticed that he had this tic that was really most apparent to his friends before he would go on stage. But eventually the tic went away, and Harry Belafonte asked him what it was that allowed him to do this. And he described this period of surrender, ultimately. And surrender for him was to the inevitability, of where life is going to go in the end, that we all will pass from this earth one day, and that once he lost that freedom of death, he had no more fear at all, and the tic just went away, So that moment for me was interesting because I look at surrender as a way of people moving through difficult obstacles in the book. But there were moments like understanding King's life story and looking at a forgotten moment that made me wonder if other life stories weren't being told fully enough. And in so doing, if we weren't depriving ourselves of the roadmaps that we all need to understand creativity more, success more, and mastery more.
And you wrote your college application essay as well about failure. You concealed it from your parents because you thought that they would think it was too risky. What exactly did you say?
That's right.
What was the essay?
So when I wrote an essay about this experience I had when I was 14. The NAACP at the time had this Olympiad, this Olympic kind of competition. Every state would enter their own students or members. And I entered this painting competition and was not expecting to win. I went to the national competition and I was more interested in everyone else's paintings than my own. So I was surprised when, after this huge ceremony in a football stadium, Rosa Parks was honored and Cornel West gave her this award. They announced the painting medalist and I was the gold medal recipient, and I couldn't believe it. And the picture shows how unprepared I was at age 14 to win this award. And I was stunned and excited. I won a computer. This is, as a 14-year-old, it's a big deal to win a computer and some money. And then 2 years later, I entered again and nothing, you know. And it really became a kind of a public failure for me in terms of the community of people that had supported me and kind of coached me to that national stage again. And I felt ashamed, I felt embarrassed, I felt all the things that you do when you fail publicly. But what I learned about my own ability to be tenacious and to pull the poison out of an experience and glean from it new information to use in order to improve was what I ended up writing about for my college application essay to Harvard. And I applied early, and so when I got in, that was it. I didn't apply to any other colleges with my failure essay. But
nice work, exactly.
Yeah, so I succeeded with the failure essay, but I hid it from my college advisor and my parents. I actually didn't even just hide it from them. I asked my parents to go away from the apartment for a day to let me write the piece because I thought they'd talk me out of it, you know? But when I went back to Harvard to write about the success-failure project they started, the long-standing dean of Harvard admission, Bill Fitzsimmons, and I saw each other after he admitted that actually he had been expelled from high school for truancy, started skipping school. He then had to apply to a high school in the neighboring town, and because of that, sees resilience as a key trait that he looks for in Harvard College applicants. He looked at my name tag and said, "I remember your essay," you know. And so it was only in that moment that I realized 17 years later I was writing an extended piece based on that essay.
Okay, now this may be getting too insiderish for our audience, but I have to tell you that at my 25th reunion, I also went to Harvard.
Yeah.
We had a panel with a bunch of classmates that I moderated, and it was all about failure. And it was about how Harvard, in particular, had not prepared the members of the class of 1986 for the real bumps along the line, what Tom Lehrer called it, sliding down the razor blade of life.
Oh,
you know? But there were really poignant stories. One woman said, "My kid is autistic and I'm drowning. I cannot keep my head above water." And another guy had failed in journalism. Someone else had had a really disappointing marriage. And it was an incredibly candid confession of how people who are taught from birth only to succeed are completely unprepared to deal with failure.
Exactly. Exactly. Harvard President Drew Faust says the same, you know, and has recently said, you know, Harvard students are not fully prepared for failure because it goes against our understanding of themselves, you know. And I think that's in part also why I wrote the book, because when I failed, not just in that NAACP story I told, when I failed at failing, you know. I wasn't prepared to understand how to learn from it. And when I failed at failing, I realized that it can unravel everything else. So why not learn how to actually succeed at it? But I started to understand that it's the one thing we're never really taught, you know. But it's the critical component in so many of the iconic achievements that it is that we celebrate, whether it's the invention of the telegraph, Samuel Morse, to Nobel Prize winning experiments, all of which I kind of chronicle in the book. But it wasn't until I started curating and really working in artist studios that I started to understand how important it was to the process of creativity.
This is not a self-help book.
No,
and it's
not
it's not a book about how to fail for most of us who will encounter the ordinary challenges of life. Mm-hmm. It's really about creativity, in some cases geniuses. These are exceptional people who failed and learned from their experiences and became even greater. So let's let's talk about some of them.
Yeah.
We have to begin at the National Constitution Center with Frederick Douglass,
Yes.
who you write about here and are writing another book about him, the greatest, largest figure in Reconstruction, more responsible for the spread of American equality than anyone else. You describe his house, and what is so surprising about your discussion of Douglass is that when he gave a famous speech, he talked not about equality, but about art and the power of pictures to transform national consciousness about justice. Tell us about that speech.
Yes. So it will surprise many of you maybe to know that during the Civil War, first in 1861 and again in 1865, he gave a speech that so surprised his audience that some consider the speech a failure, although he would go on to re-deliver it many times, in which he argued that what it would really take to mend the nation's ground and to overcome what could be called, of course, a failure, a national failure in terms of the Civil War, was best done not by combat, but by what he called, what I really call aesthetic force. What happens when you see something in the world? In his case, he's describing pictures and photographs. Of course, this was the age of pictures that a daguerreotype had just been discovered and invented. People's homes were flooded with photographs that conjured an image in the mind, what he called thought pictures, that could allow you to kind of adjudicate between what it is that you're seeing in a picture and what it is that you hope to see, such that you could critique the world around you, whether that was a critique of slavery or injustice or any inequality of any kind. It was really the earliest articulation of the way in which we are actually moved to re-envision our desired future, right? But he was hinging all of this as operating in the realm of the arts, right? He is making a case for the central importance of photography, of pictures for America's future, at a time in which this was not typically done nor expected of a man who is typically speaking about abolition, right? And it's a remarkable speech. He called the speech Life Pictures at one point, but then the title that kind of sticks is Pictures and Progress.
I mean, it's just astonishing. And you say that he was very conscious of his own image and used pictures in order to further the cause of equality.
That's right. He, as a few scholars have noted, was the most photographed American man in the 19th century. He was so well aware of the shift in perceptions that his image alone could conjure, that he was in front of the camera as often as he could be. And what I love to look at is his kind of the evolution and how he presented himself. He also took photographs, which is something I think that will come out in a book on Norton next year. But he was very conscious also of how he presented even his home. It's siting in Anacostia, Maryland. If many of you have been there, you'll be able to see that he wanted to be able to do what he could do there, which is to look at where he was born, enslaved in Maryland on the right side, and then on the left, he was able to see the top of the Capitol in D.C., where he was so prominent at the end of his life that a bill was introduced in the Senate to have his body lain in state when he died.
And he built a reconstruction of a slave cabin on his own property so he could look at it.
Exactly. In the very back of the house, there's a reproduction of the 10 by 12 windowless brick house that he was born enslaved into. And so that's actually what he could see right from his study, And he would go into that house, which he called his growlery, like a place where he would go and just get everything out and write. But I love that he wanted that reminder of where he was coming from and where he had gone, whether it was Maryland to Washington or the growlery to this prominent home.
Now, when Douglass talked about thought pictures transforming national consciousness, did he mean photographs of people like himself or of injustice of slaves, or did he have other kinds of photographs in mind?
He was talking about two things. He was speaking about the power of a photograph, but the reason why he used the word thought pictures is because he was talking about what actually goes on in the imagination, when you look at an image. I mean, the reason why the Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson exhibit that I just saw, the Paradox of Slavery exhibit here, is so effective is because of what shifted in me or in you or in you when you look at it. He's looking at this invisible internal process that we all understand, because it's why we're drawn to the arts of any kind, but very few people have actually articulated, you know. But how many movements, as I talk about this in the chapter, how many movements have really been ignited or catalyzed when a picture ignited our interest, you know?
We had this great discussion on Monday with Clay Risen, the author of a wonderful new book on the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He said what did more than anything else to get national support for that act was those photographs of the dogs in Birmingham on the school kids.
Exactly.
That's what changed the debate.
That's right. Abolition as well. It was the description of a slave ship, right? The slave ship Brooks, you know, the 1789 broadside that gave people a sense of how it is you actually could put 454 men, women, and children into that ship and the graphic inhumanity of that. Even the environmental movement, you know, that began when you could actually see Earth just sitting in its environment in space from the moon, you know, taken by the Apollo 8 crew. That image in 1968 is what gave people a sense of the Earth as living in an environment. So you can go on with these examples.
So do photographs have the same power in the age of the internet with 1 billion pieces of content on Facebook?
This is an interesting question to me. It's something I've been mulling over, because of course aesthetic force can go multiple ways. It doesn't always have to bend towards justice, although there are some that would argue that beauty always tends towards justice. I think though in this age of being saturated by images, there is a tendency to maybe be more cynical about whether or not one image can actually really arrest us and give us that same, give them that same power that Douglass heralded. But I don't believe that the technology of the soul has shifted so much that we can't be affected by something. It requires more stillness on our part, more presence, you know, when we're aware of something. But it's also why I do the work that I do, because artists, I think, are under even more sort of demands to get our attention in this moment. But I have no doubt that we always will be able to do that.
I can't help but ask about the powerful claim that beauty always tends toward justice. What about Leni Riefenstahl?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is why I say it can go either way, you know? And the reason why I use the word aesthetic force in the book instead of beauty is because I want to be sort of norm-free here. I guess a good example of this, how it can go either way, would be another story that I write about, and it connects to civil rights. So in 1931, Charles Block, constitutional lawyer, was in Austin, Texas, and wanted to go to this dance. He was in college. He went with a friend of his and was expecting just to meet some girls, really, but ended up being struck by the power of this trumpeter's horn and the genius coming out of it. He didn't know who the trumpeter was or any of his band members, but he knew in that moment, because he was living in a segregated society and the trumpeter was black, that segregation must be wrong because there was brilliance coming out of this man's horn. And that man was Louis Armstrong. And that Charles Black went on to become one of the lawyers for Brown versus Board of Education. And that was the moment when he decided to walk that way. But his friend went in the other direction. His friend shouted an epithet about Louis Armstrong despite being struck by it and went the other way.
It's the perfect story. And now I understand the source of Charles Black's defense of Brown versus Board of Education. And forgive the constitutional law professor's point, but this is Black's contribution. And I see now it came from Armstrong. So after Brown versus Board of Education came down, lots of southern states said, well, it's based on flawed empirical evidence. There are these doll studies that Kenneth Clark did, and maybe they're based on bad methodology and, you know, and so forth. It's not good constitutional law. Black just cut through all that by, he said, anyone who doesn't realize that segregation was instituted in the South with the intent and effect of degrading and conveying a sense of black inferiority should be met with the sovereign prerogative of philosophers, namely laughter. He said it was preposterous to deny what everyone knew, which was that segregation was intended to demean. And it sounds like he had his aha moment with Louis Armstrong.
He did. And he went on, as you know, to be a constitutional lawyer at both Columbia and Yale, and he held annually an Armstrong listening night to be able to remind his students, his colleagues, and himself about the man who so moved him. Yeah.
Superb. We have so many other examples to talk about. Let's discuss Samuel Morse, who we know is the inventor of the telegraph, but was a very, very frustrated artist.
Yes, yeah. Well, no, for me, a story that was exciting to tell because so few people know of him as anything but the inventor of the telegraph. And what people don't know is he spent 26 years in the pursuit of being not just a painter, but a painter of great renown. You know, he wanted to be someone akin to a Rembrandt or a Titian or a Michelangelo, but he couldn't support himself or his family. And because his writing was so sort of beautiful and lyrical, you have these descriptions of almost comical state of depression that had put him in. You know, he was oftentimes trying to get his work commissioned by Congress at a time when they were commissioning paintings. And in one letter he wrote, he was rejected beyond hope of appeal by John Quincy Adams for a painting commission. But he, in this kind of nadir he got himself into, decided one day to convert the stretcher bars of the canvas into the telegraph itself. So when you look at the model that's at the Smithsonian now, you can see the sort of kind of almost staple-like marks at the back of this wooden stretcher bars. It's the frame itself of the invention that became the way in which we can revolutionize the communications industry. So I think it's remarkable as a story about a number of things. One, how grit doesn't have to become dysfunctional persistence. How to know when actually a failed pursuit can actually be the foundation for something new. And how important grit is as a portable skill in different domains. You know.
In discussing grit, you described the work of Angela Duckworth,
yes,
who is married to the son of a member of the board of the Constitution Center and a great friend of the NCC. And you describe how her husband supported her at a time when she was herself being unsure about whether or not to pursue the PhD that she had. Talk about her research about grit and what it teaches us.
This is perfect. It's also important to discuss the way that support and fellowship is kind of a through line in all of these stories. Right? What is it that gets us through these moments, right? Angela Duckworth is a MacArthur-winning, pioneering psychologist here at the University of Pennsylvania, who's done this just path-breaking work about the importance of grit and what she's found is that it's the best predictor in educational settings for achievement, more so than IQ or talent alone, right? It's an extension, and I should say grit is not mainly the ability to just withstand a momentary distraction, but to do so over decades, years, decades, as Morse did. It took 20 years, of course, to get the patent for the telegraph and beyond. I went to her because I really wanted to understand Morse's story. I wanted to understand how you remain nimble and supple enough while being gritty, and in turn, she sort of redirected me back to my own work in the arts, because ultimately the arts is what best teaches us how to kind of have our own GPS to figure this out. But she's doing work that really extends Walter Mischel's pioneering work about the importance of self-control. Walter Mischel's marshmallow study he pioneered in the 70s, it's maybe vivid in your mind, where he asks, was it 4-year-olds, I believe, whether they want 1 marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows 15 minutes from now, right? And those that can hold out, regardless of the means through which they try to hold out by putting their hands under their legs or putting their hands in their mouths, are able to hold out for the second marshmallow, have higher SAT scores, they go on to just have more successful life outcomes in terms of achievement. So whether or not grit can do the same for us as a predictor of achievement was really the question. Self-control being more momentary, grit being more long-term. Yeah. So Angela's work really inspired me to think about the way that the arts teach us a really unique form of grit, right? A kind of agency to discern when to go which way.
Does failure produce grit? Did Morse's setbacks give him staying power?
Well, that's also what Angela has found, is that the ability to withstand failure feedback is what can strengthen grit, right? And so it's not simply pursuing your path without any obstacles or hurdles that gives you grit, but doing so in the face of failure feedback. And Morse found that when he looked at the life stories of other individuals, whether it was Pope Gregory VI or others that were able to withstand failure feedback, he was better able to consider how to do that for himself,
Yes, you quote Morse submitting himself to a famous painter in London, Washington Allston, and he expected to be praised and so forth, and instead he said, "Very bad, sir, that is not flesh, it's mud, sir, it's painted with brick, dust, and clay."
Yeah, and he was mortified by this. Oh, and well, we should read them the rest that he wrote to his...
Go ahead, this is page 182 on my galley.
It's fun to read Morse because he's so vivid. He has the early copy and I have the final copy.
Yeah.
So...
I couldn't resist reading the galley, but...
No, go on. Oh, here it is. The comments at first made Morse want to dash, he said, quote, to dash his palette knife through his work, but later made him see that, quote, Mr. Alston is not a flatterer, but a friend, and that to really improve, I must see my faults. And, he goes on to describe how other people really helped him to be able to see these moments when something difficult actually could help him. I think my favorite example is when he was actually trying to show the world, show New York at least, that his telegraph model was successful. In 1942, he had this cable that was strung through from Manhattan to Governor's Island, and a ship passed and broke the cable line. So he didn't realize it, but the trial would have been successful, but it seemed failed. And he went to sleep after yet another mortifying failure. But that prompted him to consider, what if he just eliminated the wire altogether, right? What could happen then to transmission? And that allowed him to have a sort of the oceanic extension of the telegraph.
How good a painter was he? I mean, there was the painting he did at the Louvre of all the, which looked interesting, but when he tried to convince Congress to give him the commission, it's some weird painting of a guy changing a light bulb and all the congressmen around. He seemed to have been a little off in his subject choices.
He was trying to do for the American arts what hadn't yet been done, which is to give us a tradition of history painting, ultimately. So his paintings of the Louvre and the galleries at the Louvre and the paintings that were there were, some could say they're maybe pedantic, but I would say they're incredibly accomplished, It wasn't so much that his failure was about the work, I would say, but about whether or not we were ready to receive it, And that's so much of the story of iconic artists of all kinds. Are we ready to receive their gift? It makes me think about reading some of Beethoven's notes and letters before he would debut a symphony, writing to his friend, kind of saying the effect of, this time they're really going to get it. Oh. And of course they never do. So that was Morse also. This time they're really going to get it. He would exhibit these paintings and would go into debt exhibiting these paintings. No one really wanted to see them.
This is a story that recurs in your discussion of artists, and one of the most dramatic is that of Paul Taylor, whose dance was so inaccessible to its audience that, well, tell us about the criticism that he received.
Right, so celebrated choreographer and dancer Paul Taylor in 1957 was debuting a work that would set out his kind of minimalist form of modern art. And in this performance in New York at the 92nd Street Wise Kaufman Center, the audience just, as he said, cantered out of the auditorium. They just flooded up the aisles, were running out of the theater. They didn't want to see it. It was really austere minimalism before a time when that was a style. So he had decided to catalog people's everyday movements and present that as dance. He kind of looked at people, how they ran for the bus, and then kind of slowed down to catch it. And he thought that would be interesting as a kind of movement. But the reviewers were so scathing about the dance. When Louis Horst reviewed it, he decided to, in the Dance Observer, just state the name of the dance company. Should we show it?
Show the picture,
yeah. State the name of the dance company. The reviewer stated his initials, but then left the review completely blank. So all that was actually published was just this, 4 square inches of blank newsprint, ultimately. The idea was, well, Paul Taylor won't dance, I won't write, And I learned this story from another dancer, Bill T. Jones, who told me that at the time when that came out, it was a scandal, because there were so few chances to actually get dance reviewed. But I stared at that review for a long time, because it seemed to me that it was a way, to describe the metaphor, the kind of paradox of creativity. what it means to have to start anew whenever you get critique, right? And so this chapter really looks at what it means to do that, and the two modes artists like Paul Taylor had to operate in: safe havening your work for long enough to be able to incubate it, develop an idea before it's ready for the public's view, and then to also let in critique, like Lewis Horst, to use that to improve, you know.
He was wounded by it, but didn't really change his artistic vision. And later you describe a more accessible and successful dance that was widely praised. And he almost seemed as indifferent to the praise as he had been to the criticism, because he was so inner-directed. He just was marching to his own drummer and was not going to be swayed by the opinion of the crowd.
Exactly, I love that. You know, Oriole, his most successful work, it was really based on those same movements and gestures. And when you look at the New York Times review of it, they note that. They say it's really all about these moments of just walking and pedestrian movements that make him so unique, the very thing people didn't want to see 5 years earlier. But he didn't take the acclaim as a comment on his success, you know. Instead, he said, you know, it's nice if they like it, but I never know. You know, I just make these dances in order to make things. I'm trying to really please myself and my own vision. And this book is about that inner, often invisible kind of journey with an artist figuring out if their intentions have been met by their effect or not. And oftentimes that's very different from whether the public likes it or not. It's the kind of these two alternate realities artists have to live with. I speak about this with other artists. Think of someone like William Faulkner, who published The Sound and the Fury, and it goes on to its acclaim, but it doesn't really meet his own goal. So he goes on to rewrite sections of it 4 or 5 different times, and then publishes that as an appendix to the novel's later version 16 years later, right? Artists often have this kind of inner gap they're trying to close.
The extraordinary high standards of the greatest geniuses are nowhere more apparent than in the self-flagellation of Michelangelo, who wrote a kind of profane sonnet lamenting the fact that he wasn't a good enough artist. And by the way, the Sistine Chapel was really uncomfortable to paint because he had to lie on his back and got a lot of paint all over him.
That's right. When he was doing the flood cycle, the lime plaster sprouted mold. And so he thought it was some cruel joke. And then he wrote to have himself removed from the commission. He really saw himself more as a sculptor, you know. So he really, as he said, didn't think painting was his art. And he actually had a kind of conspiracy theory about why he thought he had been put up to do it, but he wanted to abandon it. He didn't think that it was good. But he also had this way of leaving works unfinished, you know, deliberately, as a kind of a style, the non finito, as scholars would call it. And oftentimes that was for him a way of giving himself, as kind of Navajo craftsmen do, right? They leave a sort of spirit line in ceramics, kind of a reason to make more work. So I love that when his biography was completed, and Condivi only cites Michelangelo's words in this one moment, where Michelangelo's describing this unfinished work he had. He wanted to create out of the in the mountain a figure that could be seen by all these mariners who would have approached, you know. And he said, if I had been sure of living, you know, 4 times more, I would have completed this sculpture. I love this idea that we have to be propelled by something we know we might never complete, you know. I think that's what makes some of our most iconic geniuses so great. Yeah.
It's a daunting standard. Does this, I guess one thought would be this applies to geniuses, but not the rest of us. You know, Michelangelo, who's always re-examining the marble because it's not perfect, or Fred Astaire, who rehearsed all day and then said, the problem with me is I can't dance, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure that readers will ask, how does this apply to lesser mortals like us?
You know, what's interesting is I actually haven't had very many people say that yet. I think in part because what you'll see when you read the book is that these examples are really more about people trying to outdo themselves, regardless of where you are in that moment in time, you know. And so, well, because we're on a stage like this, we're speaking about more iconic figures, but I'm thinking now about someone who's relatively anonymous, who I hear from people most as who inspires them in a great way. That's Julie Moss. So this idea of the unfinished applies to athletic competition as well, and what it means to pursue that kind of physical engagement. And she is the person who is responsible for popularizing the Ironman competitions, because in 1982 she entered on a lark, found herself in the lead, and was a mile away from winning when her body just collapsed ultimately. She hadn't really trained enough. She was just doing this on a whim, really. And she found herself in a position of not being able to go on further until the person who's right behind her actually passed her by. And she had been just kind of starfished on the ground, just splayed out, to the point where her unnatural kind of body movement suggested something pretty fatal might be about to happen. You know, it was really extreme. And she described in that moment that something in her just shifted, you know. She knew she would finish that race, regardless of what it would take in that moment, knowing that she wasn't going to win still. And she describes it as a kind of a deal being struck with herself that was going to change her life forever. So the footage that you see of this is someone like tripoding themselves up, and she crawls across the finish line. I mean, she loses control of bodily movements, you know, it's a mess down there, basically. And she said in that moment that she was struck by also that voice, because some of us would have imagined that that voice would say, just give up. But instead it said, you can do more, meaning the spirit knew that it was actually, her spirit knew that it was greater than she was letting herself be in that moment. And what I love about that story is it reminds us that we are able to outdo the selves that we were before that, you know, potential failure, right?
It's a powerful example, and it relates to a phenomenon you describe that you call the benefits of the near miss.
Exactly, yeah. So there's so many achievements that have come when people have come just really close to their goal but not yet made it, and because of that frustration have thrust themselves into a terrain they never would have found before. And you see it vividly in athletic competition, as you do with Julie Moss there, but you see it with athletic competition at the Olympics most vividly. So Thomas Gilovich at Cornell did this amazing study in 1992 looking at the levels of frustration between silver medalists and bronze medalists, and found that essentially, to our surprise, because bronze medalists have more to gain from follow-up competition than silver medalists, that bronze were a little more happy with themselves, because at least they didn't get fourth place, you know, not medal at all, right? Silver medalists were more frustrated and therefore focused more on follow-up competition, right? So that plays itself out in some life stories we've seen. Think about Jackie Joyner-Kersee, you know. She, in 1984, came in, she lost the heptathlon by 1/3 of a second in the 800 meters. And because of that, her husband, Bob Kersee, predicted that would give her the tenacity she needed in the next Olympics. And there she went on to not just win the heptathlon, but she set a record that no one has come close to since, right, of 7,291 points. And he attributes it to that near win. It's a phenomenon we see in achievements that are creative, you know, more so than we might think, right? It's, in my mind, kind of what's going on with William Faulkner. It's what's going on in the life stories of lots of different individuals who achieve anything great.
The near miss makes me think, I think you interviewed Al Gore for this book.
I did.
But I asked just because we're at the Constitution Center, did you ask about his near miss and how it made him
I
real?
did,
Yeah.
I did. We were speaking at the William Morris Endeavor annual conference. I was interviewing him about reinvention, his own reinvention. So I was asking him about the most public near win you can have, really, on the stage, his own. And he was really candid about it, you know, but he didn't let us record the conversation, so I feel badly stating anything more than what I was allowed to do in the book. But I repeated a quote that he knew of Winston Churchill's, who says that success is the ability to go from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. And Al Gore laughed, and he said, yeah, but Winston Churchill later said, yeah, but success has a damn good disguise. You know? So he has felt the sting of it, and that's part of the paradox and the kind of poignancy of the near win. In order to have that propulsion, you have to get to a pretty frustrated place first.
I mean, is there a difference between the near win where you have some agency, like you can work harder to overcome it, and the near win where say your election is decreed by the Supreme Court rather than by the people.
I would think so. I would think so. But I have to say, the man I was just really privileged to speak with that day has shown such incredible re-intensification of his own life mission, you know, that whether or not he could re-enter sort of that political stage with that role, in that moment didn't seem to matter to me, you know. He's downright evangelical about the environment in a way that he never could have been before. So I think it's our gain in some ways that he's taken this turn with his life.
So even when one suffers a defeat or failure over which you have no control, it's possible to learn to reinvent yourself with grit, but be more precise, because there are no homilies, there's nothing banal in this book at all. You're very precise about exactly how to recover and reinvent yourself. And there are syndromes that you talk about, like the Dunning-Kruger effect. I mean, just give us some granularity about how to pull that sort of thing off.
Sure. Well, there are many different ways that people tend to not just overcome a failure and kind of move on, but really transform from it and become better, right? But one thing that people have to overcome is, we talk about different kind of phenomenons, the Dunning-Kruger effect or the Einstein effect, which I like even more, the kind of the cost of success, right? And in some ways, when you change paths from being an advocate for, say, the environment to being a political candidate, you have to change paths, and so you're able to see things anew and no longer assume that the way that you know to do things has to be right. There can be a kind of paralysis that can come in from that cost of success. And so one way to do that, and that I speak about in the book, is to let yourself be a deliberate amateur, you know. And in some ways, the Inconvenient Truth or other achievements of his, you could say, have come from someone who was willing to take a risk and to go into a new direction, right? So being a deliberate amateur, being playful enough to let yourself see things anew is something I speak about in the book a great deal. It sounds like you...
I love the discussions of amateur and its Latin roots and the importance of play that comes across so powerfully. Tell us about play.
Yeah, well, the roots of the word amateur are, it's about someone who actually loves what it is that they do, right? The reminder that we have there points to the freedom and the joy that comes when we actually permit ourselves to play, ultimately. So for me, looking at Nobel Prize winners Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoslov helped me understand why play is so important for serious work and innovation. For me, it's interesting because they have discovered the first two-dimensional object on the Earth, graphene, that's replacing silicone.
Amazing story.
And they discovered it by doing what no expert in carbon science would let themselves do, no physicist would let themselves do. They decided to look at whether or not they could successively rip off layers of graphite just hanging out in an ordinary pencil with Scotch tape, right? And they did this in the context of what they call Friday night experiments, times they'd let themselves work in the laboratory in ways that are unfunded because no one would dare fund these outlandish ideas they have. And they successfully ripped off these layers and found that their one atom thick layer of carbon was thinner than anyone had found on recorded, in recorded times at least. And they found a technique that got them to actually whittle it down in a more kind of systematic way. And when they submitted their findings to Nature, Nature didn't believe that they actually had discovered this two-dimensional object, which is stronger than steel, thinner than silk, and more conductive than any material we've ever found. But they were not expected to win the Nobel Prize for discovering graphene, as it's called. Andrei Geim had won the Ig Nobel Award 10 years earlier for levitating a frog with magnets.
That's important.
Yeah. But he discovered that there is a magnetic force in anything that contains water, enough so to resist the force of gravity, which was something he wanted to demonstrate with an eye-catching object like a frog. So it's what he did. But he sometimes says that he doesn't do research, only search. And what's required for withstanding a difficult path like that is letting yourself be playful and insouciant enough to ask questions and do things that others wouldn't dare, So I think for me, it helped me consider why play was so crucial, but also why play is something that few people want to speak about sort of publicly, even if it helps them. In his Nobel Prize interview, he was asked about play, and he really, he did a lot of this and, and this, and he wouldn't answer the question, and so his colleague, I guess he knows him pretty well, sort of started the answer, and he said, well, you know, you're not really taught how to do science. When you receive your degree, you're taught methods, but not truly how to do it, not how to be adventurous enough to consider new possibilities, so play helps. And then Andre chimed in afterwards, and he spoke about it. But the reason why I think play is hard to speak about openly is because it's so connected with being childlike, you know, and it's seen as the opposite of serious work. As someone else that I interviewed, Ivy Ross, says, you know, play is actually just the opposite of depression, ultimately, right? It's the ability to see possibilities when depression is the ability to see none, you know. And it's I think, played out kind of dramatically when you look at some of the work that Stuart Brown has done, who's been pioneering studies about the importance of play for being neotenous. Like, we are, as human beings, one of the most neotenous creatures. We're always growing, right, in a ways that few other species are, you know. And the way that we remain supple enough to do that is oftentimes through play. He was looking at a study, though, of homicidal males and was stumped with this committee to find what the through line was with all of these case studies, and they found that they all had severe play deprivation in their childhoods, you know. So it's a more serious issue than we think, and finding safe ways to allow for play to enter domains of serious work is really crucial, you know, and part of why the arts are so important as well.
You talk about the importance of creative play as kids, ranging from Legos to music and so forth.
Yeah.
I don't know, are video games the opposite of that? And should I be concerned my young kids not have too much screen time, or else they'll win the Ig Nobel Prize as opposed to the Nobel Prize?
You know, I was intrigued by a piece that came out in the Washington Post yesterday. I'm going to forget the byline, but it was about the ways in which our circuitry, our sort of brain circuitry, is shifting because of online reading, deep reading versus online reading, and declining modes of sort of retention when we read online, and that have me wondering a little bit more about how video games might be changing this. I just played with my cousins sort of before coming here, and one of them was playing with his video game almost the entire time. And I think that there's a lot that is inventive and incredible about digital technology, but there's some things that concern me too. I was just speaking with Amy Cuddy up at Harvard Business School, who was telling me about the way in which feedback, failure feedback for students who want to see how they're performing in an interview is more palatable when it's being done through a digital interface, through an avatar, you know, than a person telling them, oh, you need to make more eye contact at this moment, or your answer wasn't really sufficient here. So I think there's so many advantages that I would never scoff at what it's offered the world, but I just don't want it to replace human interaction. I don't want it to replace all that has come from kind of traditional modes of learning and playing too. Stuart Brown, I should sort of finally say, talks about hand-connected play and the importance of that, you know. And of course, you know, there are thumbs involved with the video game, but object-connected play is so important for some organizations, like NASA, that it makes sure that those that it hires has a tradition of playing with their hands from being, you know, from a child, and because they found that that's one of their best predictors to see whether or not someone's able to solve a problem or not, you know.
In order to play as an adult in this deep and creative sense, you have to find work that you love.
Yeah.
And the only commencement speech I ever remembered was my law school commencement talk, where the professor said, here's my big message: do what you like. Not what other people expect you to do, not what your peers expect, but do what you like and success will follow. But the follow-up, of course, is it's very hard for many people to to know what they like and to resist the pressure that makes them do what everyone else does. How can, I think both of us are lucky enough to be doing what we love right now, but I think we feel very lucky to be doing that.
Yeah.
What do you tell young kids who say, I'd like to do what I like, but how do I find out what that is?
Right. Well, I should re-emphasize that this isn't a self-help book, but
we've got to give a little takeaway
but this is really, I think, crucial because one of the reasons why play is so important is that you oftentimes can't fully figure out what it is that you're passionate about unless you engage with that idea, right? So let yourself be in a school play, figuring out if singing is right for you, figuring out if writing is really what you want to do, not just in your own mind, but actually by doing it. I think one of the reasons that people can be frustrated in this particular economy we have right now, where being innovative is oftentimes the main sort of ticket to having a life that you enjoy, is that people don't give themselves permission to explore that interest, right? And without doing that, it can always just remain a dream. And that's, I think, one of the most sad, frustrating ways of being, to walk around with a dream still in you that you don't feel that you have the right or the means to examine or to explore. So this book is a perfect example for me because I wrote it alongside another book that was first my Yale dissertation, is now this book on Harvard University Press about Frederick Douglass and images, as a fun project. I began this book actually as a children's book, believe it or not. You never think that reading it now, because there's no resemblance to that. But for fun, I wrote this children's book one Thanksgiving day, wondering what I might like to see in the world for the children I hope to have, and realized that this was the one topic we're never taught and isn't fully discussed, and just had fun with it, gave it to some friends, and they all said, oh, this is over any child's head, you gotta just write this as a book. And I did, I continued to have fun with it. So engaging with the idea that you love, I think really is the only way,
When did you decide you wanted to be a curator and to engage with art?
Yeah, that happened when I lived in New York, as a child and growing up, and I came back from college and I saw an exhibit called The American Century at the Whitney Museum in New York, and there was an installation that was meant to represent the 1920s, and it was very well done, but I remember in that moment having that spark of engagement myself and thinking, I know I would have done differently, and thought about how crucial that would have been to be able to show aspects of American culture that I wanted to see in that room that I didn't see. So I thought, well, I've got to be someone who's able to actually do a show in a museum. So I think the following year, I sought out an internship at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and I worked there in the American Paintings department, and from then on decided to find my way into museum institutions. So started curating at the Tate Modern when I finished my work at Oxford, and moved to London, and came back to New York. But as a curator, I think we're always looking for what we're failing to see and trying to give that a platform, at an institution like this or many others around the country. And that's in large part what I was still, though, doing in the book, just with paper opposed to with rooms,
I would love to continue this all night, but we have some audience questions, which I'm going to turn to right now. The book covers such a wide range of artists and public figures. How did you select your subjects?
Oh, I just answered that in part because I really did look at this range of over 150 individuals that I sort of profiled in the book by asking myself that question: what are we failing to see, right? We're certainly failing to see the sort of prescient insights, the sort of prophet-like wisdom of Frederick Douglass. When we look at that speech and don't really honor it, it's been languishing in the Library of Congress for 150 years. We haven't done any work with it. The life story of Paul Taylor I thought would be instructive, in understanding the way in which a seemingly failed endeavor can actually be the foundation on which someone's brilliant career is then created. And, so a similar criteria was something that guided me as I wrote this book, as to the one that I used as a curator. So in some ways, I curated the stories in the book. Now, the method that I used to find them, I'm happy to let remain mysterious, because I believe that the creative process is, how is it that I knew to follow an impulse that let me kind of click on a TED Talk that would make me understand that this life story of, say, Ben Saunders, an Arctic explorer who I profile, could be interesting to explore. That at least for me is part of the beauty of the creative process, because in that moment, I think when you're surrendering to an impulse, you know that you're kind of co-creating. You're letting yourself be a vessel if you're good in that moment, and if you're true to yourself in that moment for what's trying to come through you.
You mentioned Ben Saunders.
Yeah.
Do tell his story.
Oh, sure. So Ben Saunders is a British-born explorer who has recently become the first person to go to the South Pole and back, and the North Pole and back, solo and on foot. And we're the same age, in fact, we're both quite young.
Don't rub it in.
No, well, I look at you and think we're the same age too, so I don't know. And he someone whose fortitude and strength, to me, seems superhuman. I didn't understand how he was able to go to, say, the North Pole carrying a sledge of over 200 pounds and trudging what is the length of 69 marathons back to back, right? All while moving on ice sheets that, as a continent, and the Arctic is the size of the United States, right? But it's completely depopulated, so the psychological impact of that is enormous. But are oftentimes ice sheets that are moving backwards when he's trying to move forwards, in sub-50-degree temperatures. And here he was giving this TED Talk, so jovial, talking about his experience, and I thought to myself, who are you? How do you do this? So I spent 2 years interviewing him, and it was finally at the end of kind of the first year where he said to me, I can't think of a better word to describe how I did it than surrender, which he meant not as a giving up, but a giving over to the circumstance, to the fact that he couldn't control the way the ice is going to flow, right? and to, in that moment of giving over to something much larger, call it whatever it is that you want, he was able to continue to have enough access to his own internal resources so that he could figure out what to do in any given moment. It, in a way, is, for me, kind of the soul of this idea in the book, how it is we can transform out of difficult circumstance, because it's a counterintuitive idea, surrender, but it's akin to sort of pain management techniques. The idea that when you tense against something, you give it more power than if you actually let yourself release into it, so that you can keep access to all the different faculties that we have that let us know when to go what way. The martial art of Aikido, teaches us this, right? And so the story of Ben Saunders in this book is really helping us understand what surrender looks like in our everyday lives.
He also, on the iPod that he wasn't sure the batteries were gonna die, insisted on listening to happy rather than depressing music.
That's right. He said if he listened to anything even mildly downbeat, he would just be spiraling, So he said no Radiohead. What else did he outlaw? Certain music that was popular at the time in 2004 when he first became the third person in the world to go just to the North Pole. And his brother gave him sort of on his little MP3 player some music that was just listed as for emergency only. And it was, Top Gun and Rocky, music from Rocky, and kind of Eye of the Tiger, things like that. And it really helped him, but imagine what it is to be out there in a completely depopulated landscape. I remember when he told me that when he actually went to the North Pole, he stood there, he had achieved that feat. He tried to call his mother, and she was so overwhelmed that she was online at the grocery store, and she asked if she could call him back. And then he tried his girlfriend, and it went to voicemail. And then he remembered in that moment a report card that he had received when he was 13 that said, Ben lacks sufficient impetus to achieve anything worthwhile. You know, and there he was. So, yeah, it's a remarkable man.
I can't help but remembering that Alan Dershowitz was here 2 weeks ago in just, I think, the funniest performance that's ever been on the NCC stage. But he said the total panning that he got in 6th grade, he still could recite the report card verbatim. It would never amount to anything. He's dirty and unclean and obnoxious and that sort of thing.
God.
He said really fired him up and was the motivating force in his entire career.
That's exactly it. You know, that's the through line in so many of these stories, being counted out, you know, at an early age and what that does to you. I would love to know what Martin Luther King thought when he received those C's in public speaking, you know, twice.
Is there a danger to be counted too in at an early age, to get too much praise? And you say that self-esteem is rising, but SAT scores are not.
Exactly. You know, that's a lot of what Angela Duckworth's, the significance of her work is about. We've been very good as a culture in raising self-esteem of young people, right? And so the testing shows that self-esteem has been on the rise, but our ability to be creative has declined ever since the Torrance test for creative thinking were created and used. But for the first time recently, creative scores for young people have started to decline, and that's really worrying, you know. So I think there is a danger in coddling and over-coddling and making sure that people feel as if they're always good without really being good at anything, which is what Angela Duckworth is really worried about. So that is a concern. I think it is no surprise that people being counted out early on has aided them. Of course, it's a delicate balance, though, because you can have so much negative feedback that it can crush you. But being able to be resilient enough to do something with that is a kind of essential theme that I've seen run throughout these stories.
Was it Duckworth's father or someone else's in the book who asked them at the dinner table, how did you fail today?
That actually, so Angela's father did ask her questions at the dinner table, but about whether she thought, well, they were different, but Sarah Blakely's father, she being the founder of Spanx, right, one of the few self-made billionaires in America, whose father asked her what she failed at that day. And she was asked that question along with her brother, and so what that did for her, because she was made to answer the question. He would be disappointed if they didn't have anything to report that they failed at that day. Was reframed her idea of achievement. And for her, failure became the refused attempt. You know, simply not trying something became failure, not failure as a result. And that's what I speak about a lot in the book. I really don't use the word failure very much at all. And I state that pretty early on. Because as soon as you do transform from failure, you tend to call it something else, a learning experience, a trial, you know, a setback, but never really failure. So she had that moment of reframing the term. And that kitchen table, in a way, is what a lot of conferences in Silicon Valley are about, like FailCon, where, you know, incredible entrepreneurs will go and are only allowed to speak about their failure to each other, right? A room of, say, 500 will be sitting around listening to Travis Kalanick, who's CEO of Uber, for example, speak about the failures that he had on the way to that achievement. And I think it's really instructive because it reduces our fear of the kind of circumstance. And oftentimes that fear is the very thing that's actually stopping us from achieving what it is that we want.
I have to ask, what did your parents ask you at the dinner table?
You know, they asked me a number of things, but letting myself feel free to fail was part of it. They didn't ever ask it that directly, but I had a father who was a management consultant and a mother who was more creative. You know, she was an actress and a public school teacher. And so for me, the question was, was I allowing myself to be all of who I am in that moment, you know? Was I letting myself really go after what I wanted as a painter and also as an athlete, say in high school and things like that? And in asking me to be all of who I was, they were also saying, don't really be afraid of failing in any of those things, because it's kind of a Whitmanian sense of seeing yourself, you know, and it was a real gift.
Who was the most inspiring subject you covered in the book?
Oh, inspiring. It's a good question. You know, I derive inspiration from so many of these figures. I think, though, it remains Douglass.
Yeah.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass. Incomparable, really, you know. To think about a man whose very spirit could will him out of bondage, right? That alone, I think, is inspiring. But I say that in part because in some ways he has given me room to do what I do right now in this world as a curator and someone who's championing the aesthetic force of all that's around me. So in a way I feel kind of in lineage and grateful to him for these different opportunities. You know.
Well, you need to promise that when the new book comes out, we will have a follow-up conversation here at the National Constitution Center about Frederick Douglass.
I'd love to.
And until then, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Sarah Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Fantastic.
The book is available downstairs in the museum store. Maybe Sarah will come join you if you'd like to join us.
Yes, I'd be happy to sign
We'll continue the conversation.
Great.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
See you soon.